the Specsavers Optical Group, we are the classified provers to measure the standard of vision for the blind bowlers. We have different classifications, and that starts with the B1 classification, which is quite self-explanatory, and that really is that there's no light perception, and that means obviously each eye there's just no appreciation of any light. The next classification is then called B2, and that goes from being able to see hand movements to a sized letter at 2 meters. B3, which is a sized letter at 2 meters to a sized letter basically at 6 meters the bowler is able to resolve. B4, where we have a sized letter that we're able to resolve at 6 meters with a reduced visual field. Commonly used chart that we use is called the Snellen chart, and that is graded with different sized letters set at 6 meters, and that's where we get the first number of 6. The next number that we use is the 60 number with the B4, and that's a size letter that the person is able to resolve at 6 meters, and this is this size here. In America, the term 20/20 is used simply because the 20/20, the Americans measure in feet, so they measure the testing distance at 20 feet, so the first number is at 20, and the size of letter the individual is able to resolve is the 20 letter, so we get the term 20/20. In Europe, in the UK, we measure in meters, so we measure 6, the first number, and 6/6 being the secondary number there. And that's looked upon as having perfect or a very good high standard of vision.
My name's Ron McArthur. I'm national coach to the blind and visually impaired bowlers of Scotland. This DVD is designed for coaches and bowlers assistants and will be taken in a step-by-step process. We're going to cover it in 2 parts. Part 1 will be for coaches, and Part 2 will be coaches training bowlers assistants. Section 1.1 Introduction, Familiarisation with the green. The coach David introduces himself to the player Robert, and as there are varying degrees of visual acuity, tries to establish the level of the player's vision. A player can be led onto the green either by holding the coach's elbow or by placing their hand on the coach's shoulder. The choice must be left to the player. David now leads Robert onto the green edge and demonstrates the first method of entering an indoor green. As David steps down, Robert notices David's elbow drops. David explains that he needs to take a step forward to cross the ditch around the green. For the second method, David takes Robert to the side of the green where there is no raised rail. David allows Robert to feel with his foot the edge of the green, and again David steps down with Robert following. Once on the green, David tells Robert about the ditch, allowing him to feel its depth and the width. They then walk to the 2 metre mark at Robert's own pace, which allows him to judge what the distance of 2 metres really is. It is important that the players are always allowed to walk at their own pace to determine a set distance. Next, they walk to the 25 metre mark, again at the player's own pace. From here, they continue on to the 2 metre mark at the far end of the green, and then to the ditch. This process is then reversed to bring the player back to the starting end. After walking the length of the green, the coach walks the player the width of the rink as well. The purpose of pacing out the green is to let the player establish in their own mind the size of the green. Section 1.2 Familiarisation with equipment. It is important that new players have the equipment they will encounter during the game of bowls explained. The following items are required at most times: the mat, the jack, the bowls. Holding and feeling a bowl allows the player to determine the relationship of the rings to the bias of the bowl. A 2 metre stick. Although an individual player will not use the stick, it is helpful for them to have the chance to hold and understand its use in placing the jack. Thin white breakable string. The string is set the full length of the green from the centre rink marker to the opposite centre rink marker The string is used to allow the player to know where the centre of the rink is. The laws of the sport require the string to be white and breakable to reduce the risk of tripping. Section 1.3. Using the equipment. David walks Robert to the mat and hands him the jack while advising on the correct method of holding it. Robert has a practice at delivering the jack. David then talks Robert through the 4 different delivery stances: fully upright, semi-crouch, crouch, and fixed stance. The fixed stance is often preferred by B1s, as a step forward could make them feel unsettled. Here we see Robert using his preferred method, the semi-crouch. David hands Robert a ball while instructing Robert on the 2 most common grips, the cradle and then the claw. When a coach is not available, the player will have to align themselves properly on the mat. David instructs Robert how he should align himself on the mat to play his forehand and backhand. Robert is asked to use finger measurement to judge the width from the edge of the mat to his heel. A player may use a monoscope or binoculars to aid their assessment of the head. Section 1.4. Front directing. Front directing is a method to give the player the line of delivery. The coach will stand 2 to 3 metres along the string, depending on the player's visual impairment. In this method, David's foot is horizontal to the string and will vary in distance from the string depending on the pace of the green. Robert is aiming to get his ball just past David's toes. David has adjusted his foot position to correct Robert's line to the jack. Robert is now playing his backhand and David aligns himself on the opposite side of the string. This method is not suitable for B1s. David shows another method of front directing that is suitable for B1s and others. He is standing in the player's line with his legs apart. The object is to get the player's ball to travel through the gap. In the case of B1s, the director has to stand close enough to the player for the player to hear their voice, usually about 2 metres away. It is very important that the coach keeps their attention on the ball being delivered to ensure that it does not collide with their foot, as this would result in the ball being declared dead. Section 1.5. The clock and jack position. When the jack is delivered, the caller will centre it, stepping out the distance from the jack to the 25 metre mark. Here there are 4 jacks on the green as an example, each one a different distance over. The last jack is full length, which in this instance is 12 over. The third, 8 over. The second is 4 over. The first one is 0 over, i.e. it's on the 25 metre mark. The clock is a method that allows the players to know where their ball has landed in relation to the jack. i.e. 3 feet at 12 o'clock means the ball is exactly 3 feet behind the jack and on the line of the centre string. A ball 3 feet at 2 o'clock has landed 3 feet beyond the jack and to the right of the string from the mat end. A ball landing 3 feet at 5 o'clock means the ball landed 3 feet short of the jack and to the right of the string at the 5 o'clock position. 6 o'clock is always a centre line position in front of the jack, and 12 o'clock is a centre line position beyond the jack. If the jack gets moved during a game, the caller has to tell the player how far the jack has moved in relation to the distance and clock position. If the jack is now 3 metres back and 8 inches to the 9 o'clock side, This means the jack is 3 feet behind its previous position and 8 inches to the left from the player's perspective. The jack is now in the new 12 o'clock position, and all balls played and balls still to be delivered will be called from this new 12 o'clock position and not from the original centre line position. The caller must state the position of all balls relating to this new 12 o'clock position. That concludes all of part 1. We have covered the coaching manual. The one key point to remember is that we're dealing with a vulnerable group, and you have to point out to the players that you may possibly have to touch or hold them. Part 2 covers the coach training the bowler's assistant, also reading the clock, assisting a caller to read the clock, and competition level. Section 2.1, the role of the bowler's assistant. In this section, David is now training George as the bowler's assistant. The coach will have to provide the bowler's assistant with a copy of the SAB coaching manual. George is wearing an occlusion mask to try and help him understand what it is like to be a totally blind bowler. David walks him onto the green and talks through the exact same process described in part 1 with Robert. This includes pacing out the green to the various markers. Before the start, George ensures that the player has all the equipment needed to bowl, and during the game escorts the player onto, around and off the green. During the game, George would place the mat on the centre line if the player is the first to play. Complete the scorecard if that is the duty of that player, and ensure the immediate area surrounding the mat is free from any obstructions such as bowls or cloths. George would tell the player where the mat has been placed and ensure before the next bowl that the mat is correctly centred. Following the delivery of each bowl, escort the player off the mat and tell them where the bowl finished in the head. David is showing George how to make sure the player holds the bowl correctly. George attempts this for himself. During a game, George can give the bowl to the player, but he cannot align it in the player's hand. David is showing one of the stances that was described in part 1. The coach should run through all stances and delivery techniques with the bowler's assistant. After watching David, George attempts one of the stances. As previously explained in part 1, David explains to George his role as regards to front directing. George then assists Robert in delivering a bowl using the method of front directing. George must consistently stand at the same distance from the mat when taking up his front directing position. George would also assist the player in adopting the correct stance and delivery position, if and only if the player uses the front directing method. During a game, George should convey the skip's instructions to Robert. In the absence of instructions from the skip, he ensures Robert plays the type of shot, hand and line of his own choosing. The bowler's assistant should never tell the player which shot to play, but can discuss the situation with the player. George's instructions should be clear and concise, given in an even-handed and unemotional manner. The bowler's assistant must maintain a sound working relationship and build up the player's total confidence in the partnership, but the player must be the partner leader at all times. George must tell the player which hand the opponent is playing and the position where the ball has come to rest, and the state of the head if requested.
Just over a yard at 8.
Section 2.2, calling the head. The caller must stand 2 metres past the jack and 1 metre to either side. David is demonstrating how to properly call the head. A ball has just been delivered and David is calling its position by pacing from the bowl to the jack.
3 yards at 1.
In this case, the ball is 3 yards at 1 o'clock. You will notice David has his head up, facing forward and giving the
1.5
position
inches
in a loud
at
and clear voice.
2.
David is demonstrating how to call the jack distances.
Minimum jack.
He calls the first jack at the minimum distance. In the next example, David paces out the position of the second jack, calling it at 3 metres over the minimum.
3 yards over.
Section 2.3 B1 Front Coaching and Directing. For this demonstration, Robert is wearing occlusion glasses, which are required at competitions for B1 bowlers. George hands Robert the bowl, and Robert is feeling to find the bias of the bowl. He then crouches down to feel for the string on the centre line, and as previously demonstrated, the bowler's assistant would stand approximately 2 metres in front of the bowler in the correct line. The bowler's assistant would then check that the bowler is correctly aligned and holding the bowl properly on the correct bias. The assistant would stand in front of the player as the coach showed in part 1. This would be approximately 2 metres on the bowl draw line. The player would then use the assistant's voice as his aiming guide. That concludes the training DVD. If you have any problems, please contact the SAB website and we'll give you all the assistance we can.